everyone. This is Elizabeth Wilson. I'm the director of the Irving Institute for Energy and Society, and I'm really excited to have our two guest speakers today. And I have to say, our timing for this event feels pretty perfect. Um, the challenges of making policy in this new world that we're moving into on an issue as complex and embedded in climate change are hard to imagine. And our conversation today will be illuminating some of the opportunities and challenges in this policy process across government with two wonderful people who bring with them a wealth of perspective and experience on this topic. We'll first be hearing from Julio Friedmann, who's now at Columbia University, but who has worked at the Department of Energy and has a PhD from MIT. Julio and I met years ago when he was still a professor at University of Maryland. And now you can follow him on Twitter at Carbon Wrangler. And he'll be telling you, how to and why to think about these things there. So he recently served as Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Office of Fossil Energy at DOE under the Obama administration. And his expertise on carbon capture and storage, CO2 utilization, and clean coal deployment really helped to round out a conversation on climate change going forward. We also have our Abby Hopper, 93 Dartmouth grad, who is the president and CEO of the Solar Energy Industries Association. And her experience in government as the director of the Department of Interior's Bureau of Ocean and Energy Management, BOEM, and the director of the Maryland Energy Administration really let us think about this issue from a federal level and from a state level. And so this multi-level governance is critical for program implementation in climate policy, and the coordination with the federal government and state governments also really, really important. So we'll be having 10 minutes from Julio Friedmann, followed by 10 minutes from Abby Hopper, and then a conversation with all of us. And I'd like to welcome anybody who has a question for either of the speakers to write it in the chat. This series is, as you know, sponsored by the Irving Institute for Energy and Society, as well as our colleagues at the Rever Center for Energy at the Tuck School and the Sustainability Office at Dartmouth. And we're really happy that our colleagues in the School of Government and Rocky are also part of the conversation today. So with that, Julio, Carbon Wrangler, tell us where it's at. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And it's wonderful to join you and Abby here. Thanks again to the Irving Institute for hosting all of this. Mark Twain quipped, everybody complains about the weather, but nobody does anything about it. We're basically in the same boat here on climate. We've diagnosed the problem a long time ago. Really, since 1996, it's been pretty clear that man-made climate change is a big honking issue and we need to get in front of it. In a word, we've failed. We simply haven't done enough quickly enough, and as a consequence, we have more work to do now. It's important to note when thinking about this in the context of policy, whether you're optimistic or pessimistic, the work looks the same. Whether you are enthusiastic and passionate or obstinate, the work looks the same. You just got to get the work done. The job is, how do you get emissions to zero everywhere in the world? I entered into my sphere of work specifically because I was following Willie Hutton's Orton around banks. He robbed banks because that's where the money was. I do what I do because that's where the carbon is. If you care about managing carbon, here's an idea: manage carbon. So there's really only three things that you can do to get to net zero. Energy efficiency and conservation, that reduces emissions. Carbon management, which is what I do. Shutting things down. That's the full menu. There is nothing else that reduces emissions. Things like building renewables is essential. It's part of the work, but it's part of the work because it allows you to shut things down or to displace existing emissions. Net zero is the job. It's all about carbon. And that framework has reached now widespread adoption, and that's really shaken up the gumball machine. A whole bunch of people are now thinking to themselves, net zero, I got to get in front of that. So you're seeing this flurry of corporate announcements, and you're seeing this flurry of commitments from politicians and from governments and from nations. And then they turn around and go, well, how do I get to net zero? And they suddenly go, holy crap, I have no idea how we're going to get there. And the good news is we know a handful of things to do. And all of that ends up going through politics. I entered this arena thinking deep about technology and what technologies could produce. That's still an important part of the mix. One would argue an essential part of the mix. And in fact, we recently wrote a innovation guide led by Varun Sivaram at our team at Columbia, laying out an innovation agenda for a net zero world. I'd encourage you to look up Energize America on Amazon or on our website. But the bottom line is you still got to figure out what exactly to do. Innovation's part of it, but you can't innovate your way to zero. Like you just need other stuff. And that ends up being about policy and about finance. So let me put out a couple of ideas here to season the conversation in advance of our discussion, because it's easy to declare things and it's much harder to enact things. First of all, I think it's helpful to think about combining a construction agenda with a reduction agenda. If the goal is net zero, then you got to do both. So for example, you can regulate steel mills, but they are likely to keep emitting. You can combine a construction agenda with a reduction agenda by replacing existing steel mills with non-emitting equivalents. That is a lot harder than it sounds. It's a lot harder than it sounds, but it is doable, and you have to think about that as part of the work. Otherwise, people just pay fines and keep emitting, and that doesn't help anybody, actually. That's just generically bad. Same thing's true in the power sector. We have had great success in the United States displacing fossil energy. First, coal being displaced by gas, increasingly renewables replacing coal and gas. Like all of that's good, but the replacement's the piece. If you're not displacing these things, you don't get to zero. So you need to figure out how to combine a construction agenda with a reduction agenda. And building things like carbon capture and storage is one way in which you can think about doing that. Another action set is you really need to think about all sectors. A lot of people confuse energy and electricity. Please allow me to help you with that. Energy is not electricity. And also, people confuse energy emissions with global carbon emissions, also not the same thing. So to give you a sense, in the United States, electricity is the third largest emitter. Industry is the largest, transportation is the second. 2/3 of the transportation emissions do not come from cars. They come from other stuff. So if you reached the electricity sector down to zero, incredibly difficult hard work, which I'm sure Abby will talk about, and you used additional renewable zero carbon construction to get to the vehicle fleet, to electrify all the cars in the United States, congratulations, you've done about 40% of the job. There's another 60% after that, which is agriculture, which is heavy industry, which is trucks. It's just, you got to think comprehensively about how to do that, because otherwise you've built 1/3 of a bridge, and that's just not going to get you over the Rubicon. In that context, as a policymaker, it's helpful to discuss and go back and forth the balance between regulation and investment. So one of the things that we saw during the campaign is a whole bunch of the Democratic contenders were all raising their hands and saying, I'm going to spend $2 trillion a year. I'm going to spend $10 trillion a year. People are just throwing out the trillions. You don't need to necessarily spend any trillions to do this. You could do the entire thing with regulation. It's not efficient. You'd create a whole bunch of backlash, but it would do the job. Money is not the metric here. The metric is tons. So it's only helpful if you invest that money well. To be clear, we do not have the tools today to determine what those good investments are. We've made our own little contribution at Columbia with a levelized cost of carbon abatement. But if you ask people, okay, I build 1,000 megawatt, nuclear plant, how much carbon savings do I get? That's a really hard question to answer, actually. And so you got to start reframing these things in tons. One of the most important policy actions that a person can take is actually just about tools and analysis and data. I was surprised to find out that if you want to get data on ammonia production in the United States, that's managed by the United States Geological Survey. There's some weird connection back to some mineral resource in the past where ammonia was considered a mineral, and therefore the USGS has jurisdiction. Like, we don't even gather a whole bunch of data that we need to answer this question, much less analyze them in a sophisticated way, much less share that with people who can make decisions. So there's actually just a policy agenda on building out that knowledge infrastructure that's helpful. Last but not least, in a legislative context, there's only so much we can do with executive orders. We can talk more about that later. But fundamentally, if you got to legislate, you need a unity platform. What President Biden said in his inaugural was spot on. Like, this is a time for unity. If you think that being more shrill is going to get you your legislative agenda, you got another thing coming. We actually got to figure out how to be bicameral and bipartisan. If it doesn't work in the House and the Senate, if it doesn't work for a plurality of legislators, you're not going to get what you want. And it is helpful in that context to think about how to be inclusive, how to build the biggest possible political coalition for a deep decarbonization climate agenda. That should include disadvantaged communities. It should include labor. It should include business leaders. It should include red state Republicans and red state Democrats. Like, you need to get all these people on board. And if you don't agree with me, the new chair of the Energy and Natural Resources Commission, Democrat Joe Manchin from West Virginia, has another thing coming. He wants a unity platform and he's eager to legislate on climate, but he's not going to do it in a way that is politically not actionable. That's his brief, and that's fair. As a parting thought to the listeners, I am a huge, huge enthusiast of sustainability measures of all kinds. We're doing a pretty bad job on biodiversity and forests and ocean acidification and serving indigenous peoples, all 17 of the UN sustainability goals. But out of the UN sustainability goals, only one of those is carbon. Tackling the other sustainability goals doesn't get you carbon. You can spend a lot of money working on that stuff and end up in the wrong place on climate. Similarly, equity is not carbon. It's incredibly important that we build equitable solutions, in part because that's politically viable and it helps build that broader coalition. But serving disadvantaged communities doesn't get you carbon. You have to go after the carbon. Passion does not equal carbon. Being more exercised and more angry doesn't solve the position either. You gotta get the tons. And I wake up every morning thinking, how do we reduce the tonnage going into the air and oceans, and how do we take it out of the air and oceans? And in that context, I'm looking forward to an exciting 4 years and an exciting 40 minutes of discussion with Dr. Wilson and with Abby.
Julio, that was a fabulous way to kick us off. And again, for our listeners who just joined us, please submit your questions into the Q&A box. And I appreciated your bringing up the equity considerations as part of the space, but the need to focus on that long-term goal as well. Our programming last week looked at the challenges of climate and the challenges concurrently. So this week's conversation of bringing those together is something that I'm really looking forward to in the policy space and discussion. Abby, 10 minutes from you, please.
Great. Julio, thank you for those opening comments. They were really thought-provoking and much appreciated. And Dr. Wilson, thank you for inviting me to be a part of this. I just want to say a word about the Irving Institute and how grateful I am for my involvement with it. I've said this to Elizabeth personally, but I am a 93 from Dartmouth and probably was on the list of inactive alumni for a long time. But this engagement with Irving has really brought me back to the campus virtually, but certainly to a connection to my alma mater. So I'm deeply personally grateful for that. So thank you for the opportunity. I'm going to share a little bit about riffing off of what Julio said and kind of walking through my own experiences at sort of these different levels of government and talking a little bit about sort of the coordination. I could not agree more with Julio that this is about carbon, right? We can talk about jobs, we can talk about solar, we can talk about renewables, we can talk about equity, but if we want to solve this problem, we have to focus on carbon. And that as our North Star and that as the piece the puzzle we're trying to put together is how I think about it personally. But it is this is a large, ginormous system we're talking about. I think honking, you might have used the word honking, Julio. And I reflect back on my time at the Department of Interior. I am guessing that probably 0 of you know what the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management is. 100% of you know what it does, right? I led the agency that does all siting, permitting, environmental review for offshore oil and gas development, all of it, and offshore renewable energy development, offshore wind. So I had the opportunity to hop on helicopters and go to offshore drilling platforms. And it left such an incredible impression on me. The infrastructure, the hundreds of billions of dollars that have been invested in that important piece of infrastructure. And as we think about how we're going to solve the carbon crisis, I think we need to be very cognizant of the fact that that investment has been made, that those jobs are there, that energy is flowing, and understand that getting to net zero, we have to be cognizant that just putting more solar panels on our houses is not going to be enough. And I lead the solar industry, I can say that, right? So I say that to say that we are talking about big pieces of infrastructure, similar to what Julio was saying, right? That's not, even if we decarbonize all of electricity, we haven't come close to solving the problem. I reflect on my time in state government and think about the way in which we interface with the federal government, right? And how what we were doing in this little tiny state of Maryland, which is mighty and powerful, but little, what that meant for our citizens, but what it meant for a role model for other states, and how we could lead by example there. And so as I now have this opportunity to interface with governors, interface with presidential administrations, I see that interaction, and that there is a real opportunity to put these policies together and really push forward. I think about the next 4 years as an opportunity to really use all the levers of government to help solve the crisis. As Julio said, we've done a kind of crappy job so far, but it does feel to me, I'm sitting here in Washington, D.C., that we are on the cusp of a different approach. And I say that because I have never heard, seen, or witnessed such a focus on climate, not just from the climate people or the enviros or the Ds or the, fill in the blank, but Secretary Yellen talking about having someone at the Department of Treasury focus on climate and how climate affects our financial systems. And I'm sure there will be someone at the SEC thinking about risk, right? What kind of climate disclosure risk do investors need to be made aware of, and do companies have to have an obligation to provide? And thinking about the Department of Commerce, right? And how do they play into this, and where are they spending money, and what kinds of investments are we making with our assets? And so there is just a I believe, a holistic look across the federal portfolio, with climate and carbon reduction as a defining characteristic and as a North Star for that. That gives me a ton of hope. And so I think we will see in the next 4 years, and I'm excited to talk more about it, all of these different levers. But it's that alone. I mean, we can't technology way out of this. We can't federal government our way out of this, right? That is not enough. We need our states and our local governments pulling in the same direction, pushing in the same direction. And so the other things that give me hope are that, I have the benefit of working in lots of states. Some of them have Democratic governors. A lot of them have Republican governors. I think about the great state of South Carolina, that 2 years ago, with a Republican governor, a Republican House, and a Republican Senate, at the state level, passed this incredibly comprehensive solar bill that had areas of growth for utility scale solar, for corporate procurement of solar, for residential solar, for low income solar. But you know what it was called? The Energy Freedom and Jobs Act. It was not called the Green South Carolina Act, right? It wasn't called the Save the Planet of North Carolina Act. It was the Energy Access and Competition and jobs. And so I think there's a great opportunity to work in concert with state governments and legislatures and governors to really figure out where they play, right? Because so much of our energy policy in the United States is at the state level. And then I think about the locals, right? The mayor, the council of mayors, and all of the mayors, when the president last week signed back onto the Paris Accord, said, yes, we are still with you. We are still in. And the way that those mayors and that level of government intersects with its own citizens, it's a much more personal relationship. And having those local communities really be committed to carbon reduction, it is meaningful. It is an incredibly meaningful thing. I will, at the risk of being a little repetitive, I will certainly reiterate what Julio said about the need to be bipartisan. I have the benefit of representing businesses, and businesses need certainty, right? And so thinking about how we create durable policy, not policy that swings back and forth at every election, is how business and investment is going to grow. And that's what's really going to help us reach this decarbonization. So we can talk a lot more about the players in Washington and the players across the nation, but that searching and finding that magical, bipartisan, bicameral, durable policy is what I think will really help us address the crisis affecting our planet. So, Elizabeth, I will turn it back to you.
Well, I really want to thank both of you for those comments, pushing us to think about these in bigger ways. There are three questions I'm going to ball up into one because they all address the same issue. Jacob Orrock, Tom McHenry, and Jonathan Winder are talking about your statements on building a bigger climate tent, but actually how to achieve that in practice. Tom McHenry, the Dean of Vermont Law School, writes that, given Tony Lacerowitz's research on the 6 Americas and the 70 million people who voted for Trump, how do you actually kind of bridge this gap? And it's a very challenging to build that larger political condition. And any suggestions you have, we'll start with Julio and how we might do so. Thank you for your questions, everybody. Please keep them coming. And the others were similarly engaged about how do you actually do this in practice? And Abby, I think you started to get to that with your answer about the mayors and the states and the other levels as well. So please, Julio.
Sure. So the first thing you can do is ask them. Honestly, have you asked what qualifies as something that's politically acceptable to you? A lot of Republicans want to enact energy and climate legislation. They do. Those include committee chairs, those include key members and ranking members. There's a lot of people who want to do something. You can ask them their priorities and try to figure out how to make a deal. I've spent a lot of time in red states. I've spent a lot of time with CEOs. I've spent a lot of time with ours in both houses. These people are not Dickens cartoons. Like they actually have political constituencies and issues they care about. They can do arithmetic. They have all the information that the Democrats have, and they understand it just as well. They see the world differently. So you got to ask them. And it's not helpful to say they're jerks, so we can't work with them. That is not a recipe for success. It's the opposite. They're actually good-meaning people who want to help their constituencies. Where can you find consensus? A Republican Senate and a Republican Congress and a Republican House and a Republican president passed massive investments in clean energy innovation, passed massive tax credits for renewables and for CCS and for nuclear. There's an opportunity to do industrial policy in both houses. Then something interesting perhaps with agricultural policy. Talk, think, invite a conversation as opposed to declaring a difficult start.
I would agree with that. I spend a ton of my time here in Washington having those conversations that Julio is recommending. And I have never spoken with an elected official, it doesn't matter their party affiliation, who has not agreed that the world is changing, that the weather, for some, they view it through more drought, more severe storms, more fires, more outages, right? Whatever their constituents are living with on a daily basis. For some, they see solar businesses or clean energy businesses popping up all over their state and bringing tax revenue to their communities. For some, they are hearing from the big corporates who are thinking about coming to their state but are demanding access to clean energy and saying we need to look at how do we get access to that, or we're not bringing our data centers, we're not bringing our hundreds of millions of dollars of investment, so fix it. And so it is it is very much an active and alive conversation. It gets very politicized when you sort of get in front of cameras. I will agree with that. But my job and all of our jobs is to figure out where there's mutual agreement. I think one of the most powerful stories that I talk about is when I was working in the great state of Maryland. So Maryland is one of the biggest poultry producers in the United States, and poultry houses have to be kept at a certain temperature and a certain humidity to keep the chicks growing. That obviously is incredibly energy intensive. We helped farmers put solar on the top of their chicken houses, brought down the cost of their energy, increased their profitability. I can almost guarantee you most of them were not registered Democrats, but they understood how this technology was impacting their business, and that mattered deeply to them, and they became great advocates. And so looking for those wins and looking for how it affects people in their own lives. And so to your point, Elizabeth, the mayor of a small town in the Eastern Shore of Maryland talking about what it means, or the mayor of a small town in Colorado talking about the community center that the solar developer built, or there's just tons of examples. I would say too that this is a holistic solution set, and so there is political power in the technologies that Julio has been working on and researching. When I go in and I do advocate with the carbon capture people, like the CCS and solar and wind, and we have similar kinds of tax credits, and we go in together and say, I'm not fighting with him. Like, if you want to extend my tax credit and his tax credit, I'm good, right? Like, and that has political appeal. And I think we need to be pragmatic and not purists about this.
Well, and there's a question that we'll get to later about CCS and viability, but I wanted to go to one of the questions that was raised earlier on, and we'll start with Abby, on what are your perspectives on President Biden's current policy plans? Are they enough? What changes are needed in your mind? And I'll add one more point. What types of coordination do you think are required to actually take these plans to fruition? Thank you.
Yeah, it's a really important question. So I don't think any of us could overstate the importance of the coordination, right? It is a big, audacious goal to try to solve this crisis. There are the federal portfolio, the federal empire almost is big and unwieldy, and there are lots of deep pockets. And so having a team at the White House, which President Biden has put into place, that is charged with, in my mind, overseeing and coordinating this effort, I think was an incredibly wise move. We put out, right after he was elected, so our 6 for 46, what we wanted the president-elect to do. And that was one of them. We needed a climate czar to sort of oversee all of these moving pieces. So I'm heartened that it's in place. I will be more heartened when it's operating, right? It's a little too soon to figure that out. I am heartened that the Biden climate plan does have equity at its as a fundamental core tenet. That it is not an afterthought, that it's not a check the box over here on the side, but that it is a central part of its proposal. I think that will bring durability in a way that, we talked about political durability, but I think kind of systemic durability if we really are addressing the needs of all of our communities. I am not, in my current role, we are not wedded to a particular tax policy. I mean, as a private citizen, I think a carbon tax is the most efficient and makes the most sense, and we can talk about why. As the head of SEIA, we just want stable policy, right? And so I am not critical of the president's approach on that front in any way, whatever we can get through Congress. I think more will be revealed as these days unfold, but for now, I'm excited about his strategy because I think it is holistic, both in terms of how to address the problem and the types of communities it's trying to reach.
No, and I appreciated in our earlier conversation, there's a climate office now in Treasury, and there's one, that coordination piece is something. So Julio, please, to you.
Yeah, so just a friendly amendment to what Abby said, there isn't a climate czar, there's three or four climate czars, which is more appropriate, actually. And I would ask your audience to recognize that global emissions are 15% the United States, 85% everybody else. The biggest thing that they've actually done is really have an international task force led by John Kerry. There's never been anything like it before. Somebody of his understanding and stature, former secretary of state, former head of the Foreign Relations Commission. Um, and there's already 30 to 50 people who've been named who are going to work for him. That's appropriate. Like that reflects how complicated that is. And the international policy team has a bunch of good stuff and a bunch of good ideas around building sectoral clubs of nations that can go after things like steel and manage the trade issues at the same time, which are very, very difficult. Or a decoalification agenda specifically. How do you squeeze the coal out of the system, even as countries like China and India and Southeast Asia are all building coal plants? Like, how do you decoalify it? Like, that's a hard thing to get your hands around. But you need a team of people working it or else you're going to fail. Same thing's true on the domestic brief. Butts in seats matter. And the fact that he's got Gina McCarthy and Ali Zaidi on the beat is incredibly important. And a bunch of the other names who've been put in there. As Abby said, there's no substitute for leadership and there's no substitute for the whole of government approach. The Biden team's very much on that. And I expect that we're going to see a whole bunch more in terms of executive orders that come out quickly because they've been thinking about this for a while. This is not their first rodeo. They've been given solid advice for a long time. The real issue, in my humble opinion, is how they actually work with Congress. And in that, we have a senator in Joe Biden who has been in the Senate for almost 30 years, who knows everybody, who's passed bipartisan legislation, who knows how it works. Another incredibly capable senator in Kamala Harris, who cares passionately about climate and will be on the job almost all the time in her role as vice president. There's such an opportunity to think about building bipartisan legislation with those people in that team that I'm pretty optimistic, actually. It doesn't make it easy, but it makes it more straightforward than it has been.
No, I really appreciate this. Could you each give, and Julio, thank you for bringing up the international dimension, what climate change is. This talk is focused, of course, with you both here on US policy, but with the recognition that we're embedded in a much larger international conversation. I'd like to ask each of you to give kind of one example and highlight who the different players will be in actually moving it forward. I appreciate that for a lot of us who are all over the world at this point, understanding kind of how one issue actually moves and who has to be involved and what decisions they make is really useful for just both appreciating the complexity, but also these coordination aspects. And Julio, there were a few questions on the feasibility and viability of carbon capture and sequestration. In the answered box, you've put a few tabs, but maybe you want to address that in this response as well. Thank you.
Well, I get extra points for difficulty. I feel like an Olympic diver.
Absolutely. The double cork back whack.
So let me start, use my favorite example for this, which is actually the example of this whole set of discussions, which is infrastructure. Okay, let's talk about how you build infrastructure and get the job done. Okay, the power sector is a lot easier than the others because it already has infrastructure. There's already a bunch of transmission lines in place. If you add renewables to the grid, or if you add any zero carbon source to the grid, it can go into the grid. That is not the case for things like CO2 pipelines, which are not ubiquitous, which are not easily accessible by the public and stuff. So there's in fact an infrastructure build out just for decarbonization on its own. But which agencies manage infrastructure? Well, Department of Transportation spends money, builds stuff, and regulates it. They regulate things like natural gas and CO2 and hydrogen pipelines. So they have an incredible role. Pete Buttigieg is new to the beat. He's going to be pretty awesome, actually. I have an awful lot of enthusiasm for him in the job. Existing money is already going through Congress. They can shape that with report language. They can just, lay out standards about how to get that done in a clean fashion. Of course, they can appropriate more money as well. So for example, they can give new authorities to the Department of Transportation or the Department of Energy to help build out infrastructure. And that could be done through things like the Loan Program Office at the DOE, or that could be done through new authorities that were just enacted under the omnibus bill. You need to get local buy-in for a lot of this stuff. You know, people like to think that there's some, you know, magic wizard in Washington and stuff just happens. Like, no, there's always local panels, there's local pushback, there's a lot of hand-holding and discussion, there's contracts, there's land access, there's legalese in order to get this stuff done. Like everybody gets a chance to help here, right? But fundamentally, there's only a couple of players and a couple of agencies at the federal level who do this. One example of something that could be done is to set a clean procurement standard, a buy clean kind of standard for things like cement and concrete and steel. Government buys 50% of the concrete in the country. They buy 20% of the steel in this country. So they have a pretty outsized say in terms of what the purchase standards for that stuff are. That ends up becoming a job for NIST, National Institute for Standards and Technology, and Department of Commerce. It becomes a job for the Department of Energy to help set the standards using science. Interior provides access to pore volumes for CO2 storage and stuff. And there's a lot of ways in which you can tag individuals within government and agencies within government to get the job done. Two quick things on CCS. One, there is no substitute for butts in seats in government. You need good butts and good seats. And at the Department of Energy, the Office of Fossil Energy is now being led by the new Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary, a good friend, Jennifer Wilcox, incredible scholar, incredible actor. Like, she's a good butt and seat to get stuff done. There are 21 large-scale CCS projects working in the world today. They capture 40 million tons a year and store it underground. The oldest one's been working since 1996. Like, this works at scale well. We've put 400 million tons of CO2 underground. And I would encourage people to look at my answers. Go to the Global CCS Institute website. Every year they give a status report on CCS. The costs are coming down. The financial opportunities are growing through things like the 45Q and the low carbon fuel standard. There's like an incredible deep bench of scholarship about this. It's just one of those things we got to do. In the same way that offshore wind is one of those things we got to do. Like, we got to do it. And so we can debate its costs and merits and staging and all this stuff, but if we know we have to do it, well, we should probably start doing it. And the infrastructure ends up being an important part of that piece.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Julio. It's funny, I was gonna use the offshore wind example as a way to answer Elizabeth's question. So you were a perfect lead into that. So sort of to illustrate, this is not a holistic answer, this is an illustrative answer, right? So if you think about offshore wind, and there's clearly an opportunity to, it's not going to solve all of our carbon problems, but it is a low carbon, no carbon source of electricity that we really need to hold. So, okay, so out of the COVID bill that just passed at the end of December, there was language in there to tell the Secretary of Interior to set goals for renewable energy development on public lands. So Deb Haaland, that's soon to be hopefully Secretary of the Interior, she will, probably task some of her people and come up with that goal. And then the head of BOEM, who hasn't been named yet, will, move forward and say, okay, we need to build X number of gigawatts in the next 4 years. We need to lease X number of gigawatts, permit X number of gigawatts. Let's go do that. Well, they have the primary responsibility, but certainly not all the responsibility, right? The Coast Guard is going to say, hold on a minute, you're going through my traffic lanes, so this is going to be a problem. So then Secretary Haaland will call Secretary Buttigieg and say, hey, I think, or Homeland Security, whatever, one of those departments, and say, hey, we have a problem. And then the Department of Defense is going to say, whoa, whoa, you can't build here because it impacts the radar systems. And so Secretary Haaland is going to call Secretary, the one who was just sworn yesterday, and say, we have a problem, right? And they're all going to say, no, my people are telling you this or this or this. And then that's why it's important to have the climate czars. I accept your friendly amendment, right? This would be one for the domestic side, probably. So Ali or Gina, and say, hey, we have interagency conflict about this goal. And so Gina or Ali or one of your staff How should we do this? And then someone's going to call Brian Deese, the head of the National Economic Council, and say, hey, Brian, offshore wind represents this incredible economic development opportunity in the Northeast states. And they are governors who are putting their political futures on the line, making a political bet on this. And so we need to make sure that we can see the economic part of this. And so then Brian's going to call Gina and say, hey, what do we do about this? And then they're going to tell defense and Homeland Security and I forgot commerce, right? The fisheries, the lobstermen are not going to be happy, and the scallops are not going to be happy. And they're going to call Gina Raimondo, and Gina's going to say, hey, or Secretary Raimondo is going to say, hey, this is a problem. All right, so you see all these different constituencies, and this is how it's going to work. And we need someone centrally located taking all this input in. We haven't even talked about the governors calling in. We haven't talked about the mayors calling in. We haven't talked about the national NGOs calling in. That's how this is going to work. But if we have someone in the center kind of managing all of these conflicts and saying, our North Star is carbon reduction. Offshore wind will get us there. It's an important piece of the puzzle. And so we're going to solve these other issues to the best of our ability, but we remain committed to this. That's, in my opinion, a real life example of how that coordination has to happen. And I think we could take out offshore wind and put transmission line. We could take out transmission line and put fill in the blank. But that's how all of these different pieces work together.
No, I really appreciate this conversation. I was teaching right before this, and today's class was on coordination and how you actually solve real problems. And so highlighting to the students, everybody who needs to be involved, a lot of them they felt was kind of unnecessary bureaucracy, but you appreciate the deep standing and the need to ensure that all of these different pieces fit and are fitting together. And we've talked about, infrastructure, which is big, offshore wind also big, but a specific technology. And the one group we haven't talked about, because this is a policy focused discussion, but I did want to talk about the private sector. And then we'll move back to policy, and we have about 15 minutes left. But just there have been a number of questions in the chat about accountability in the private sector, about ensuring that promises made or promises kept. One example that somebody discussed was the National Association of Builders, this is Chuck Fenton, is pushing to lower building code standards at the same time. And so and I know you both work with, there were other questions on legacy oil and gas, and I know you work with these different groups. So if you could just talk a little bit about, from a private sector perspective, the incentives that you need to actually meet some of these goals. And I think, Abby, your earlier points that you made about certainty moving forward. So we'll start with Abby, and thank you very much.
Yeah, I have to admit, I can't, if I start reading the chat, then I get all distracted. So I've been focused
That's
on
my job. That's okay. My job. I'm just trying to ball it up. If there's a private sector component here that you can roll with.
Thank you. The private sector is important. That's my job. I represent them. But what I think is really interesting is the role of corporate in pushing lots of sustainability efforts. Obviously, I'm particularly focused on the electricity sector, Julio's differentiation earlier, and certainly the commitments that corporates are making around electricity, renewable energy procurement. I think it has moved the market. I think it has certainly created demand. I think, as my example earlier, going to governors and saying, unless you give us access to green, clean energy, we're not coming to your state and bringing economic investment. I think we do a report every year, which you can find on our website, around corporate procurement of solar in particular, both on site, so on top of your local Target or Walmart, but also off-site procurement where they enter into contracts for it. 2/3 of that electricity is being contracted for by small businesses. And I mention that because, to me, it's sort of if the big, the Amazons and the Walmarts are the federal, the big dogs, the small businesses are the local communities and some smaller states, right? So their ability to kind of follow the lead and then implement it for themselves. So I think that the private sector has really made a ton of progress, and I think that their shareholders, their customers, and their employees are going to hold them accountable. I personally don't feel a big need to have some kind of a regulated accounting system for their commitments, because I think they know who their constituencies are, and they will hold them accountable. I've hosted Whole Foods and Amazon and Walmart on many panels, and especially a couple of years ago said, like, why are you doing this, right? Like what, tell me the business case for this. And the business case is our customers, our shareholders, our employees are demanding it, right? Oh, and it's the right thing to do, and it's saving us money. But there is this awareness that is really important. It goes to the point we made earlier about how this is not necessarily a Republican or a Democratic thing. Target, Walmart, Amazon, Apple, they all, they compete for number one in terms of procurement for renewables. There's a bunch of others in there, but they're not all just like Silicon Valley tech companies. Walmart is a huge player in this.
Thank you. That's a very useful perspective from solar. What about you, Julio?
So let me build on that on a couple of levels. I completely agree with everything that Abby just said. There's been this sort of weird sort of anti-profit, anti-corporate sort of thread that's grown in the environmental community, and frankly, I'm just baffled by it. Like, I don't know how you get the job done without the money and the human capital that are in corporations. I just don't imagine how you do it. And that's pretty broadly the case. One of the questions in the thread was like, well, what should oil and gas companies do? And I'm like, that's an excellent question. They have engineers, they have geoscientists, they have financiers, they have traders, they have project managers, they have immense capital assets. Like, they could do a lot. We got to think about what's the right thing to ask them. Like, that's a good thing to do. And they're not homogeneous. Exxon is not the same as Occidental. It's not the same as, Aramco. These companies are very different in terms of their leadership, their asset classes, their skill set, their geography, and you have to actually get into it to think about what's a useful thing to do. A couple of broad things about the role of corporations. The thing that they value the most in all of this is surety. This is where Abby came from before. Like, if they had a carbon tax, they would know how to do it. If they have tax credits that come and go, they have a much harder time planning around these things. Like, they want sureness. So from a policy perspective, make it big, binding, and down. If it's big, binding, and down, they'll know what to do because they're very good at that part of it. So one way to do this, for example, would just be a national emission standard in which you say, for a power sector, for industrial sector, whatever you are, you can emit this many kilograms of CO2 per megawatt hour or equivalent, and every 5 years we're going to drop it until we get to zero. Big, binding, and down. That would do the job, and that would allow them to rank their assets, to rank their investments in a sensible way against that backdrop. So they need that kind of surety. The most valuable thing that companies can contribute, first and foremost, is leadership. And I know there's a lot of people out there who are like, how do we hold their feet to the fire? It's like, first, clap them on the goddamn back. The CEO of Dow came out and said they're going to be net, they're going to double their ambition and reduce their emissions, scope 1, 2, and 3, at like twice the rate to 2030. And then they're going to be to zero by net 2050. And immediately the Twitter sphere was like, that's bogus. How do we know they're going to be this? It's like the world's biggest chemical company said they're going to do net zero and made an interim commitment. That's awesome. Be happy about that, right? Try to figure out how to help them. And this gets to the last component of sort of what I wanted to lay out here. I've seen a whole bunch of crazy pitch decks in the past year or two. And these are companies who are like, we're going to do carbon, we're going to do money, and we're going to put together a fund and throw your money in here, and it's all going to be great. If those people had said the same thing about dollars as they had said about carbon, they would be in jail. Because it's fraud in terms of representing what they can do, right? We don't have anything close to the Securities and Exchange Commission in terms of regulating the way that carbon is managed. What's valid and verifiable? What's real? Part of the reason why is because we haven't done it. Now that we've got Janet Yellen's new climate group in Treasury, I'm hoping we'll do some better stuff in that. But part of it is it's actually objectively hard. And emissions accounting, like scope 1, 2, and 3, is just the way that we do this. Like scope 1 is what I emit, scope 2 is what I do emits, and scope 3 is like everything else that's associated with me emits. So in my world, like scope 1 emissions are things like I drive a car. Scope 2 emissions are stuff like I buy electricity. Scope 3 emissions are like I live in California and we have freeways, like, and we have concrete on the freeways, and that's part of my emissions portfolio, right? Scope 1 and 2 are built on sort of a polluter pays kind of principle, and it makes a certain amount of sense from a policy perspective. Scope 3 is kind of bonkers. Scope 3 is the entire world. So right now, for example, like if you're an oil company and you sell a ton of oil, most of your emissions are in scope 3. It's in the carbon in the oil, okay? If you're a chemical company and you sell a sealant or an insulating tool, like your scope 3 emissions go up, even though that product reduces emissions. And if you're a banker, your scope 3 emissions are 0, even if you own the oil company and even if you own the chemical company. Like, we don't even know how to count this stuff carefully or well, much less like how much carbon actually goes into soils, much less how much, carbon is tracked into other parts of the economy. Like, where do you draw the lines in terms of who owns what? Like, it's objectively hard, but we got to start that work, or else the companies will not know what they're on the hook for, so they can't act sensibly.
Well, and one of the things I've really appreciated about this discussion, there was a question here from David Perlman about public policy, investment, and technology, and we've addressed them all today. And so how they fit together and the different roadmaps you gave us of the complexities of who's involved, as well as for this administration, the climate superstars to watch out for, from Secretary Kerry to Gina McCarthy and Ali Zaid and Pete Buttigieg and, like on and on and on, Deb Haaland. And we'll be watching these. And I almost want to bring you back on every issue and tell us, like, who do we watch, what decisions are needed to make this happen. So thank you so much for your professional and personal perspectives on these critical topics that we're all moving forward with. I wanted to give you 2 minutes each before we show the next events. And we have a bunch of events from Colombia in this week's list too, thanks to Julio. 2 minutes each just to wrap up your big thoughts, what you're going to be looking for, and just close it up for us. Thank you. I'll start with Julio.
Thank you. That'll give Abby the last word. So the big thought that I have here actually comes from an oceanographer, Walter Munk. Walter and Andy Revkin, the journalist, went to the first papal encyclical meeting, Laudate Si, and they left discouraged. It wasn't clear how we were going to get to where we needed to get. And Andy asked Walter, Walter, what do you think it's going to take for us to get there? And Walter's response was, it will take an unprecedented act of generosity and love. That's actually what the climate task set is. There's going to be fighting. There's going to be battles. There's going to be tussles. There's going to be splitting and debates and acrimony, because that's going to be part of the landscape. But we have to start by being generous and open-minded, because it's the whole globe and everything we do. If we're not generous, we will not serve indigenous peoples and disadvantaged communities. We will not generate wealth. We'll have deprivation and difficulty. We will build enemies that endure, domestic and abroad. Like, we gotta be generous. We have to think about how to be additive and positive in every possible way while we're getting to net zero. It's not an easy mental framework to take, but that's actually the most valuable one, not just for the climate, but for the politics and the policy.
I promise we didn't plan this, but Julio, I really appreciated those words, and mine are very similar. I feel more hopeful about our future than I have in a very long time. I really see solving our climate crisis as an opportunity, as an economic opportunity, as a justice opportunity, as clearly a way to address wrongs of the past. I think that I feel like we're in good hands. I really do. I trust the leaders who our president has put in place. I think they have the experience. It's not Julio's first rodeo either, as demonstrated by his awesome outfit, but it's certainly not their first rodeo. Like, we have experienced practitioners at the helm. And so, yeah, there will be some difficult conversations and some policy differences, and that's to be expected and shouldn't surprise any of us. But I feel a ton of hope. I feel a ton of opportunity coming. And I think it will lead to some really good outcomes for our planet and our people. So, Elizabeth, thank you.
I want to thank both of you for a super and spirited conversation. I knew when Julio agreed and Abby agreed that we would just have fun. And from the level of questions and back and forth from our participants, thank you to everybody for your engagement. This series of critical infrastructure in a climate changing world started out describing the problems. Today, we're framing kind of the policy opportunities going forward. And in future conversations, we're talking about finance and specific technological components. And so I really am grateful for your giving us the insider outsider perspective and who to watch while we're making these critical decisions. And I wanted to, again, look forward to seeing you both on our programming and also as we move forward in building the Irving Institute at Dartmouth. Everybody, thank you so much for participation. Audience, this has just been a wonderful conversation, and we'll see you all again soon. Take care, everybody. Stay healthy, stay safe. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Namaste.